Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back into the 1950s, but not the version with the sock hops and the wholesome sitcoms and the cheerful housewife waving a pie out of a spotless window. No, tonight we are looking at the other side of that postcard. The women with the inherited money, the household staff, the charge accounts at department stores with enough zeros to make your eyes water. Rich women in 1950s America. Not celebrities, not movie stars, just quietly, obscenely comfortable women living in homes the size of small school districts with nothing but time, expectations, and an inexhaustible supply of white gloves standing between them and a full psychological crisis. Before we go any further, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And if there is a topic you have been dying for me to cover, drop it in the comments. Someone suggested tonight's topic and I genuinely love you for it. It keeps this whole thing going. Also, if you prefer to drift off on Spotify, the link is in the description. We are over there too now, so find your platform, find your pillow, and let's get into it. Now, dim those lights, turn on a fan if you have one, pull that blanket up, get horizontal, take a breath, and let the day go. Because tonight you are not going to need any of it. But first, have you ever wondered what it actually looked like to be rich and female in 1954 America? Like, what did you do all day when you had a cook, a housekeeper, a nanny and a husband who left at 8 in the morning and reappeared at 6 expecting a drink and a calm atmosphere? Did you just sit there? Was there a schedule? Did anyone ever crack? Was there a system for deciding how many luncheons a person could attend before losing the will to live? Did you have opinions you were not allowed to say out loud? Did you pour your entire inner life into the correct folding of a monogrammed napkin and call it fulfillment? Were you bored? Were you brilliant? Were you both, simultaneously, in a house that smelled like gardenias and quiet desperation? Congratulations, you have just woken up in 1953. You're wearing a silk robe, your hair was set last night, your children are with the help, and there is absolutely nothing on your schedule today except everything that is expected of you. Welcome to the life. You do not simply wake up when you are a wealthy woman in 1953. You emerge. The alarm goes off at 7, or perhaps the maid knocks softly, or perhaps you simply wake because your body has been conditioned by years of social obligation to do so, and what follows is not a morning so much as a production. The face must be done before your husband sees you. The hair, set the night before in pin curls and a silk scarf, must be combed out and arranged into the signature soft wave that signals you have your life under control. The robe comes off and the house dress goes on. But not just any house dress, the pressed one. The one that says I am at leisure but I am still formidable. By the time you arrive in the breakfast room, you have spent 40 minutes on your face, 20 on your hair, and you have made approximately 0 decisions of consequence. The day has not technically started, but you are already performing it. The products alone are a commitment. Cold cream to cleanse, toner on a cotton round, foundation, powder, a careful line of brow pencil because your actual brows are considered an unfinished thought, a very precise application of lipstick in a shade you have worn for 6 years because it is correct, and correctness is not something you abandon on a Tuesday. There is no such thing as a quick face in this world. A quick face is something other women have. Women with fewer obligations. Women whose husbands have already left for the office and will not see them until dinner. You're not one of those women, or if you are, you're pretending you're not. The hair is its own chapter. The pin curls were set last night with lotion and patience, and now they must be released and brushed and shaped into something that looks natural, which is to say something that looks like it required no effort, which is the most effort of all. The soft wave at the temple, the roll at the nape, a light mist of spray, applied from a distance so as not to make it stiff, because stiff is the enemy, stiff is the woman who is trying too hard, and you are never trying too hard even when you have been at your vanity for 45 minutes with the focus of a jeweller. Then the house dress. This is not a negligee, and it is not an evening outfit. It exists in a specific category designed for the domestic hours before the social hours, and it must be spotless. You press it yourself or you have it pressed. It is belted because everything is belted in 1953, because a waist is a moral position. You check your reflection once, and then again, and then you allow yourself to be satisfied, which is not the same as being pleased. By the time you arrive at the breakfast table, it is 8:15. Your husband is already there, or already gone, and either situation requires its own management. The coffee is poured, the table is laid, and you sit down to begin your day, which has in fact already been going on for over an hour, and which will not be acknowledged as having started until you are formally in a room with other people who can see you. This is the baseline. This is before anything has happened, before the children, before the staff, before the first of the day's social obligations arrives with its own requirements and its own unspoken rules. You have not yet done a single thing that anyone will remember or notice or thank you for, and the day is just getting started. You're doing great. Breakfast in a wealthy 1950s household was not made by the woman of the house. It was made by someone she employed, supervised, occasionally praised, and quietly lived in terror of losing. The cook arrived early. The kitchen was her domain, and the woman of the house entered it the way a ship enters a harbour, carefully, briefly, and only to give instruction she hoped would be followed. There was a specific social minefield embedded in the daily negotiation between an educated, bored upper-class wife and the woman who actually kept the household running. Too much direction, and you were difficult. Too little, and things went wrong, and it was somehow still your fault. You reviewed the menu for the day, approved or amended it, and retreated to the breakfast table, where the coffee was already poured and the grapefruit was already halved, and your husband was already reading the paper without looking up. Breakfast itself was a specific meal with a specific register. Not lavish. Lavish was for guests, but correct. The grapefruit was halved and segmented. The eggs were prepared to order, which in this household meant your husband's preference was known and executed without being asked, and your own preference was whatever required the least bother because you were not the point of breakfast. Toast in a rack, not on a plate, because toast on a plate goes soft, and soft toast is an amateur situation. Coffee in the good pot, not the everyday one, because even a private Tuesday morning deserved some standard. The housekeeper arrived at 8, and the cook had been there since 7, and the negotiation of their respective domains was a thing you managed the way air traffic controllers manage runways, with total focus and no acknowledgement that anything was difficult. If the housekeeper thought the cook had overstepped into the pantry organisation, that was your problem. If the cook felt the housekeeper's dusting schedule was disrupting the kitchen timing, also your problem. You were the management layer between these two women, both of whom were essential, neither of whom could be replaced without a minimum of 3 months of social catastrophe, and both of whom knew it. The staff ate separately in the kitchen after the family had been served. This was simply how it was done, and it was not examined. You knew their names and their family situations and whether the cook's daughter had passed her school examinations, and you asked about these things in a warm, genuine, slightly formal way that communicated care while maintaining the exact distance the arrangement required. This was a skill, actually, the calibration of warmth and distance. Most women of your position had been watching their own mothers do it since childhood, and had absorbed it the way they had absorbed table manners, without being taught formally, simply by being in the room when it was demonstrated. Your husband finished his eggs, folded the paper to the business section, and left for the office at 8:45. He kissed you on the cheek on the way out, or he did not, depending on the day and the general weather of the marriage. The door closed behind him, and the house became yours again, or rather it became the space in which you operated, which was different from belonging to you in any way that would have been useful. The cook was already moving on the lunch preparations. You had a committee meeting at 10. The children needed to leave for school in 20 minutes. The grapefruit sat, half-eaten, on the good china, and the kitchen was already in motion, and somewhere inside the smooth, well-oiled machinery of the morning, you existed in a role that had no name other than wife, which was enormous and invisible in equal measure. Rich women in the 1950s loved their children the way they loved their good china, deeply from a respectful distance, and with significant anxiety about anything going wrong. The nanny handled the morning. She got the children up, dressed, fed, and delivered to school or to the nursery depending on age, and she did all of this with the quiet competence of someone who understood that her job was to make motherhood look effortless from the outside. The mother would appear briefly, to kiss a forehead, to ask how the night went, to make a gentle suggestion about the day's schedule, and then she would withdraw back into the adult portion of the house. This was not cold. This was the arrangement. Children in wealthy post-war homes were loved extravagantly, but parented at a slight remove, because close hands-on mothering was considered the province of women who could not afford help, and these women could very much afford help. The nanny was a specific kind of professional relationship, different from the cook and the housekeeper in one important way. The nanny had access to your children, which meant the nanny had access to evidence about your parenting, which meant the nanny knew things, whether your son had nightmares, whether your daughter ate her breakfast without argument or required 45 minutes of negotiation, whether the children asked for their mother during the day, and, if so, how often and in what tone, and whether that tone was anxious or merely habitual. You did not discuss these things with the nanny in any depth, because discussing them would mean acknowledging them, and acknowledging them would mean evaluating them, and evaluation was not available on a Wednesday morning when you had a luncheon at 12:30. You spent time with your children in the late afternoon, between 4 and 5:30, which was their clean time, bathed, dressed, calm after the school day, not yet tired enough to be unreasonable. This was the time for sitting together in the nursery, for reading aloud if they were young enough, for asking about the school day in a way that was genuinely interested and also very slightly formal, because you had not been there for the actual day and were therefore working from incomplete information and relying on the children to fill you in, which children do inconsistently. There was also the dinner appearance, in which the children came downstairs in their pyjamas to say goodnight, and this was a beloved ritual and also, honestly, a bit of a performance. The picture-perfect moment of the family assembled before the evening proper began. It looked beautiful. It was brief. The nanny took them back upstairs, and you went to refresh your lipstick before cocktail hour, and the house returned to the adult key it operated in for most of its waking hours. You loved your children. This is not in question. But love in this world had a grammar, and the grammar had a lot of clauses about appropriate distance and the value of letting professionals handle the daily management so that the relationship between mother and child could remain elevated, unhurried, and unmarked by the friction of things like lunch and nap resistance and the particular misery of a 5-year-old who does not want to put on shoes. The nanny, meanwhile, knew everything. She just never said so. That was also her job. If you think wealthy women in the 1950s were simply lounging around eating bonbons, you have fundamentally underestimated how structured and exhausting a life without paid employment could be. The social calendar was a full-time occupation, managed with the seriousness of a military logistics operation. There were luncheons, and there were teas, and there were committee meetings for the symphony and the hospital auxiliary, and the garden club and whatever charity had recently been adopted by the women in your specific tax bracket. These were not optional. Attendance was tracked, absences were noted, and the consequences were social rather than financial, but no less real. Showing up was the job. Looking wonderful while showing up was the other job. And making sure the right people saw you looking wonderful while showing up was the third job that no one ever named out loud, but everyone understood perfectly. The calendar was kept in a leather-bound book, because of course it was, and it was maintained with the precision of a scheduling department. The luncheon on the first Tuesday of every month, the symphony committee on alternate Wednesdays, the charity gala in November, for which planning began in April, the bridge game on Thursday afternoons, which was social under the cover of a game, which was its own kind of genius because it gave everyone a reason to be in the same room for 3 hours without anyone having to admit they were there specifically to see and be seen and monitor the general social temperature of their world. A conflict in the calendar was a genuine crisis, not because any individual event was irreplaceable, but because declining things had consequences, and the consequences compounded. Miss the luncheon once, and you're simply busy. Miss it twice, and people begin to speculate about why. Miss it a third time, and you're no longer quite in the loop, and being out of the loop was a form of social erosion that was very difficult to reverse once it started. You attended things you did not want to attend. You smiled through events that bored you into a kind of meditative state. You made conversation about subjects of no interest to you with the focus and skill of a professional diplomat, because that is effectively what you were. The planning involved in a single week was not trivial. Which hat for which occasion? Whether the Tuesday luncheon and the Wednesday committee meeting could share an outfit if you changed the accessories, or whether someone who had seen you Tuesday would also be at Wednesday, in which case 2 separate ensembles were required. Whether to send flowers to the hostess before or after the event. Whether your thank you note needed to be handwritten, or whether a telephone call would be sufficient, and the answer was almost always handwritten, because handwritten said you had made the time, which was the whole point. By Friday afternoon you had attended 4 events, written 6 notes, made 14 decisions about your appearance, managed 2 scheduling conflicts, and done all of it with the serene expression of a woman who found this effortless. You had not found it effortless. But effortless was the performance, and the performance was non-negotiable. You were in every practical sense working a full week. The absence of a paycheck did not change the hours. Getting dressed in 1950s high society was not a matter of opening a closet and choosing something comfortable. It was a structured daily negotiation between the occasion, the season, the audience, and the rules. And there were so many rules. The morning house dress was different from the luncheon suit, which was different from the afternoon ensemble, which was different from the cocktail dress, which was an entirely different category from the evening gown. White gloves appeared for certain occasions and not others, and knowing which occasions required gloves and what length was a form of cultural literacy that separated the women who belonged from the women who were still figuring it out. Hats had their own logic. Shoes had to be matched precisely. Handbags were coordinated and never oversized, because a large bag suggested you might be carrying something you needed, which suggested you were doing things for yourself, which undermined the whole presentation. Your wardrobe was not stored casually. It was organized by category and season with the methodical attention of an archive. The winter suits here, the day dresses there, the cocktail dresses in the cedar closet wrapped in tissue, because fabric has enemies, and you are not going to let them win. Shoes in their original boxes with a photograph on the outside, so you could find them without dismantling the entire system. The hats on their stands on the upper shelf. The gloves in a drawer sorted by colour and occasion length. This was not a closet. This was a filing system for a professional identity. Dressing for an event required lead time, not because you were indecisive, but because the correct outfit was a calculation with multiple variables. the other women who would be present and what they typically wore, the hostess's aesthetic and whether you should compliment it or simply not clash with it, the weather, which affected fabric choice, and whether the coat needed to be considered as part of the total effect. Your own recent appearances and whether anyone at today's event had also been at last Thursday's luncheon, because repeating an outfit with overlapping audiences was a risk you managed consciously and deliberately. Shopping was itself an event. You had accounts at the department stores and relationships with specific saleswomen on the good floors, women who knew your size, your colouring, your style, and who would call when something arrived that seemed right for you. You didn't browse, you were shown things, evaluated them, and decided. Alterations were expected. The clothes were fitted because they had to be fitted, because a dress off the rack without alteration was an admission that your body was average, and in this world nothing was permitted to be average. The pressure was consistent and low-grade and entirely invisible to anyone outside the system. No one said you must dress this way. No one issued penalties for a wrong choice. The enforcement was social and atmospheric, and far more effective than any written rule could have been, because it lived in the slight pause before a compliment, the fractional shift in someone's expression, the absence of comment where a comment would have been welcome. Your wardrobe was the first sentence you spoke every day, and you could not afford a bad sentence. Lunch was where the information moved. Not at the dinner parties, not at the charity galas, at the quiet, impeccably set tables of private clubs and wood-panelled restaurants, where women gathered in groups of 4 to 6, ordered the chicken and a glass of white wine, and proceeded to conduct the social business of their entire world in the space of 90 minutes. Who was struggling? Whose husband had been seen somewhere inconvenient? Whose daughter was becoming a concern? Which family had recently done something that required community processing? None of this was called gossip, of course. That word was for small-minded women, which these women were absolutely not. This was information sharing, social monitoring, the invisible maintenance of a community that ran entirely on reputation and required constant upkeep. The food was beside the point, the conversation was the point, and the silences were often more significant than either. You arrived at the correct time, which was not early and was not late, but was the specific moment that communicated ease without carelessness. You greeted the others with the warmth that was appropriate for people you had known for 15 years and saw 3 times a week, which was warmth calibrated to the exact setting, genuine but not effusive, friendly but not loud. You were shown to the table, which was your usual table or close enough to it. You ordered without consulting the menu because you knew the menu, and consulting it would suggest either unfamiliarity or genuine indecision, both of which were to be avoided. Then the conversation began, and this is where things got interesting. The surface layer was news, children, husbands, recent events, upcoming plans. This was the warming up layer, the layer that established tone and allowed everyone to calibrate. Underneath it, running at a different speed, was the actual information. You would learn at this lunch that a marriage in your circle was more troubled than appearances suggested. You would learn that a family's financial situation had shifted in a direction that had not yet been made public. You would learn which of last week's dinner parties had contained a moment that was now being discussed, and whether the woman responsible knew she was being discussed, and what the general consensus was about her. All of this arrived without anyone saying it directly. It came in half sentences, in questions that seemed innocent and were not, in the pause after someone's name was mentioned, which communicated volumes depending on its length. You were fluent in this language. You had been speaking it since you were old enough to attend these lunches as a young married woman and watch the older women and understand slowly that what appeared to be pleasant conversation was actually precision communication in a highly compressed form. You ate approximately half your lunch. The wine was finished. The notes would be written tonight, a thank you to the hostess if it had been a hosted occasion, or simply a few mental notes about what you had learned and what, if anything, needed to be acted upon. By 2 o'clock you were back in your car heading to the afternoon's next obligation, carrying information that would be useful, some of it immediately and some of it months from now, like seeds. This was not lunch. This was the work. Every wealthy woman in the 1950s belonged to at least one club and chaired at least one committee, and the amount of energy that went into those committees was genuinely staggering in proportion to the amount of practical output they produced. The garden club met monthly to discuss things that could have been handled in an email, if email had existed, and would still have been discussed for 4 times as long as necessary. The hospital auxiliary raised money and organised volunteers, and gave the women a sense of purpose that their domestic arrangements did not reliably supply. The symphony board meant season tickets and opening night dinners, and a vague, ongoing sense that one was supporting culture. These organisations were not frivolous exactly. They did do things, but they were also very much the acceptable container for the ambitions of women who were not supposed to have careers and needed somewhere to put their considerable intelligence and organisational ability so that it did not become inconvenient for anyone. The committee meeting had a structure as reliable as a church service, the convening. The minutes from the last meeting read aloud by the secretary, a position that rotated among members who all secretly found it slightly demeaning, but accepted it because the rotation was fair and fairness was important. Old business, which was everything that had been decided at the last meeting and not yet executed, requiring a status update from whoever was responsible, which was often a slightly painful moment. New business, which was where the energy was, because new business meant decisions had not yet been made, and therefore positions could still be staked. The chairwoman of the committee held a position of real social authority, not legal authority, not financial authority in the personal sense, but the authority to direct the work of a room full of intelligent, capable, underemployed women who had collectively decided that this committee mattered. And when collectively intelligent people decide something matters, it does. The chair ran the meeting. She managed the difficult members, the one who talked too much, the one who objected to everything on principle, the one who had a competing vision for the whole organisation that she advanced at every available opportunity through the mechanism of appearing to ask innocent questions. You had chaired a committee. You knew what it cost in invisible labour, the phone calls in the week before the meeting to gauge the temperature of the room, the decisions made in advance that were then presented in the meeting as open questions so that the outcome felt collective, the management of the difficult member through complement and strategic assignment to subcommittees where her energy was absorbed before it could become disruptive. This was organisational management. In a different context, in a different era, it would have been called leadership, but it was a committee, for a charity, for which you were not paid. And the meeting lasted 2 hours and produced 3 decisions and an action item list that you would follow up on by telephone, individually, with each member, in the days following, and then you would do it again next month, and the month after. Because the committee needed to exist, and you were good at running it, and being good at something, even an unpaid invisible something, was better than the alternative. Somewhere between the end of lunch and the beginning of cocktail hour, there was a stretch of time that no one quite knew what to do with. The children were in school or with the nanny. The social obligations of the morning were complete. Dinner was being handled by the cook. The house was quiet in a way that was either peaceful or absolutely maddening depending on the day, and the woman and what she'd been thinking about lately. Some women read, not frivolous novels, which were permissible, but the kind of reading that made their husbands mildly nervous if they mentioned it at dinner. Some women painted or played piano with a dedication that had nowhere to go, because performing in public was not something women of their station simply did. Some women sat in their beautifully decorated living rooms in the silent company of their own thoughts, and arrived at conclusions about their lives that they then immediately set aside because there was nowhere to put them. The afternoon hour in a large, well-staffed house had a particular quality. It was not the quiet of exhaustion, and it was not the quiet of contentment. It was the quiet of a pause, of a machine between tasks, of a person who had been performing since 7 in the morning and had temporarily run out of audience. The cook was in the kitchen. The housekeeper was somewhere upstairs. You were in the sitting room, in the good chair by the window, in a house that was beautifully arranged for a life that was happening in it, and for 45 minutes nothing was required of you. This was the time women picked up books that they put down when someone walked in. Not because the books were inappropriate, the books were perfectly respectable, but because reading in the afternoon felt like an admission that you were unoccupied, and unoccupied felt like it needed explaining, even in an empty room. So some women read, and some wrote letters, and some made telephone calls that were less necessary than they appeared, and some organised things that were already organised, and some simply sat and looked out the window at the garden and existed in the unusual and slightly uncomfortable freedom of having nothing to do. The garden was often a genuine solace in this hour. Not the managing of the garden, which was handled by the gardener, but the sitting in it, or the walking through it, the physical fact of being outside the house, in something that grew without being told to, in air that did not smell like furniture polish and the cook's preparations. There is a reason so many women of this era described their gardens with a warmth and specificity that they did not quite use for anything else. The garden asked nothing of them. It was simply there, doing its own work, indifferent and alive. By 4 o'clock the children came home, or the nanny brought them down from the nursery, and the afternoon hour was over and the performing resumed. And the book went back on its shelf, half finished, waiting for tomorrow's quiet, which would arrive and feel exactly the same, full of possibility and slightly too heavy to be only peace. The home was the primary expression of a wealthy woman's competence in 1950s America, and it was evaluated constantly and without mercy by everyone who entered it. The decorator was a professional relationship that sometimes lasted decades and occasionally resembled a marriage in its intensity and its arguments. You had opinions about the drapery fabric and the sofa legs and the exact shade of the dining room walls, and you expressed these opinions carefully, because the result of those opinions would be displayed to every person who mattered in your life for the next 5 years. Getting the house wrong was not like failing a test. It was like wearing the wrong thing to the wrong event every single day, in front of the same audience, indefinitely. Getting the house right was a quiet, enormous, rarely acknowledged achievement that you were expected to make look entirely natural and effortless, as if it had all simply arranged itself out of good breeding and favourable karma. The decorator came with a point of view, which was useful and also the source of nearly all the conflict. His point of view was professional and informed and slightly condescending, in the way that professionals who deal primarily with people who have money but not expertise tend to become. Your point of view was personal and specific, and based on the fact that you were going to live in these rooms every day for years, and the decorator was not. The negotiation between these two things was protracted, collegial and exhausting, and at the end of it you had curtains that were very nearly what you had imagined at the start, which you considered a reasonable outcome. Every room told a story, and you were responsible for the story being correct. The entrance hall said, "Arriving here means something." The living room said, "We are cultured but not pretentious, comfortable but not careless." The dining room said, "This is a household where things are done properly, where meals are occasions, where the table is set with the full silver and the good crystal, because Tuesday is not a reason to lower your standards." The library said, "Someone in this household reads, and not just the magazines." The children's room said warmth and order, and a childhood that was both privileged and structured. The flowers were part of it. Flowers were delivered weekly or arranged from the garden by your own hand if you were the type, and some women were very much the type, treating flower arranging with the seriousness of an art practice, which it arguably was. The arrangement in the hall, the smaller arrangement on the dining table, the single bud in a good vase in the guest bathroom because the guest bathroom was also being evaluated and should not be overlooked. Guests noticed everything. They did not always comment because direct comment was considered slightly forward, but they noticed. The small signal of a slightly tired sofa cover, the draperies that had started to fade in an uncorrected way, the absence of fresh flowers when flowers were expected. And they filed it away, not maliciously, it was not malicious, but the filing happened. The house spoke before you did, and you had to make sure it was saying the right things in the right tone at all times. This was, when you thought about it clearly, an enormous amount of responsibility to place on a set of curtains. At 6 o'clock, or whenever he arrived, because his schedule was real and hers was flexible by definition, the husband came home and the house had to be ready for him in a way that required preparation that had been ongoing since approximately 4 in the afternoon. The children needed to be in a presentable state, not too loud, not too wound up. The cocktail ingredients needed to be arranged. Your own appearance needed to be refreshed, powder, lipstick, the hair checked, because the transition from daytime to evening required a visible effort that was itself a form of welcome. Magazines from the 1950s were remarkably direct about all of this. There were actual articles about how to greet your husband at the door, what not to talk about during the first hour he was home, how to make the home feel like a refuge from the pressures of his day. No equivalent articles existed advising him on how to acknowledge that her day had also been something. The freshen up before his arrival was a ritual with its own precise timing. Too early and the lipstick faded before he walked in. Too late and you were still in the bathroom when he opened the front door, which communicated a lack of readiness that was to be avoided. The goal was to be in the sitting room, or moving gracefully through it, looking composed and pleasant when the door opened, the way a stage is set before the lights come up. You had been on since 7 in the morning. You were going to be on for another several hours. The freshen up was the intermission nobody acknowledged. What he could not bring home, the difficult meeting, the frustrating colleague, the day's accumulated stresses, because these were his to deposit in the house, and the house's job, your job, was to absorb them without adding more. What you could not bring home, the committee conflict, the social tension from the luncheon, anything requiring his engagement or decision that was not directly relevant to his domain, because his domain was the office and your domain was the household, and the crossing of those lines was understood to be unwelcome even when it was unavoidable. The actual greeting varied by marriage and by day. Some men came home warm and present, genuinely glad to be there, interested in the children and the evening's plans. Some came home quiet and needed the first drink and the first 20 minutes of silence before they were available. Some came home in a state that required delicate management, not anger exactly, more a kind of pressurized energy that needed careful handling before it could be released into something tolerable. You learned to read this at the door from the way he set down his briefcase, and you adjusted accordingly. This was a skill. Nobody called it a skill. The magazine said, make him feel that coming home is the best part of his day. They were not wrong exactly, but they were describing something that required sustained invisible effort from one person in service of another person's comfort, with the invisible effort remaining invisible and the comfort being considered simply the natural atmosphere of a good home, rather than the daily achievement of a very capable woman who was, if everyone was honest, tired. Cocktails at 6 were not primarily about drinking, although drinking was absolutely happening. They were about the decompression ritual, the transition ceremony between the day and the evening, a structured social moment that gave everyone in the household permission to settle. The drinks tray in a wealthy 1950s home was a serious piece of furniture with serious contents. Good scotch, good gin, vermouth, the proper glasses. Making a drink correctly mattered. Being handed one mattered. There was communication happening in the cocktail hour that had nothing to do with what anyone was saying. It was about proximity and ease and the quiet negotiation of how the evening was going to feel. Many women of this era drank more than their social presentation suggested, not publicly, not catastrophically, but consistently, as a private management strategy for a life that demanded a great deal and acknowledged almost none of it. The drinks tray was yours to manage in the sense that everything in the house was yours to manage. The bottles were replenished before they ran low because a nearly empty bottle on the tray communicated a lapse. And lapses were not permitted even in the small domestic details that no one was officially monitoring, but everyone would notice if they went wrong. The ice was in the bucket. The lemon was cut. The cocktail napkins, small linen monogrammed, were arranged in a way that appeared casual and was not. You had thought about the drinks tray in the same register that you had thought about the flower arrangement and the dinner menu and the morning house dress, which was the register of never not thinking about it. Your own drink was usually something moderate, a gin and tonic, a glass of sherry. Something that said, I am participating in this ritual without suggesting that the ritual was load-bearing for your emotional stability, even on the days when it was somewhat load-bearing for your emotional stability. The point was to appear easy, to appear as if cocktail hour was a pleasant pause in a pleasant day, rather than the first moment since 7 a.m. when you were allowed to sit down without an agenda. The conversation during this hour had its own rules. Light was the register. The children might be produced for their brief appearance in pyjamas freshly bathed, performing their version of a good evening, and there was genuine warmth in that moment, a real softening in the room, before the nanny took them back upstairs. Then the evening returned to the adult register, and you talked about what was coming, dinner that night, plans for the week, the party on Saturday, or about what had happened in the world, which meant his version of what had happened in the world filtered through the newspaper and the office, and your version, which had come through the luncheon and the committee meeting, and was therefore not considered news in the same way. By 7 o'clock the drink was finished, or nearly so. Dinner was being plated in the kitchen. The evening had found its temperature, and whatever the day had been, the committee, the luncheon, the afternoon quiet, the freshen up before his arrival, it had been absorbed into the smooth surface of a household that appeared, from the inside and from any conceivable outside angle, to be running exactly as it should. You were very good at this. Nobody said so. It simply continued. A dinner party given by a wealthy woman in 1955 was not a casual gathering. It was a performance that had been in rehearsal since the invitations went out 6 weeks prior, and possibly in conceptual development since the last dinner party, when she'd made a mental note of what had gone slightly wrong and how to prevent its recurrence. The menu was planned, adjusted, planned again, and reviewed with the cook until it was balanced and seasonally appropriate, and neither too formal nor too relaxed for the specific mix of guests, whose social positions relative to one another had been carefully considered in the seating chart, which was its own separate puzzle. The flowers were ordered, the silver was polished, the good china came out. By the time the guests arrived, the hostess had been preparing this event the way a general prepares a campaign, and she was expected to spend the entire evening looking like she had thought of it all that afternoon on a whim. The guest list was the foundation of everything. Get the guest list wrong, and the evening could not be corrected by any subsequent excellence. You needed the right number, 8 was ideal, 10 was manageable, 12 required more staff and a longer table, and a seating chart of genuine complexity. You needed the right mix of people, which meant not all from the same social tier because that produced nothing interesting, but not so varied that the tiers were conscious of themselves across the table. You needed at least one person who could carry a conversation on almost any subject. At least one couple whose marriage was stable enough that they did not produce tension, and no one who was currently involved in a conflict with anyone else on the list, because if you had missed a conflict and seated them incorrectly, you would know it within the first 15 minutes and there was nothing to be done about it. The seating chart was produced on small cards, rearranged, produced again. Husband and wife were never seated together. That was a rule as firm as any in the etiquette books, because married couples at a dinner table retreated into their private register, and the table lost energy. You alternated men and women, and you placed the most interesting conversationalists at the middle of the table, where their energy could radiate in both directions, and you put the difficult guest next to yourself, because managing the difficult guest was your responsibility, and you could do it better than anyone else at the table, and everyone present implicitly understood this without it ever being said. The evening itself required a performance of serene attention. You greeted, you introduced. You moved through the cocktail portion of the evening, making sure no one stood alone for more than 90 seconds. At dinner, you monitored the table's temperature, whether the conversation had found its current, whether anyone had gone quiet in a way that required rescue, whether the pacing of the courses was correct and the cook's timing was holding. You participated in the conversation fully while doing all of this simultaneously, which was a feat of divided attention that would have been recognised as impressive in any other professional context. The guests left by 11. The house was quiet. The cook had gone. The silver needed to be accounted for and the table cleared and the notes begun in your head about what had worked and what wanted adjustment. You sat for a moment in the dining room after everyone had left, in the quiet that followed a successful evening, and the candles burned down a little further, and somewhere in the warm and slightly tired satisfaction of a thing done well, you allowed yourself to feel good about it. You had earned that, even if no one had said so specifically. Charity work was not optional for wealthy women in 1950s. America, it was the approved channel for everything that would otherwise have had nowhere to go. Drive, organisational talent, strategic thinking, the desire to have a project that mattered, the need to feel useful in a way that a clean house and a successful dinner party could not quite supply. All of these things went into the charity work, and the charity work absorbed them and turned them into something that the culture considered appropriate and even admirable. Women organised galas and fundraising drives and volunteer programmes, and capital campaigns with the focused intensity of executives, without the title, without the salary, and without the cultural permission to call it what it was, which was work. The work was real. The outcomes were real. The erasure of it as professional contribution was also real, and most of the women doing it were perfectly aware of all three facts simultaneously. The hospital was the most serious of the charitable enterprises, and the women who ran the auxiliary boards of major hospitals in the 1950s were operating organisations of genuine complexity. They coordinated hundreds of volunteers. They managed events that raised significant sums. They built relationships with hospital administrators and physicians, and navigated institutional politics with the finesse of experienced negotiators. They made decisions about resource allocation and public communication and community outreach. In any other context, the women doing these things would have been called directors, managers, executives. In this context, they were called volunteers, which was technically accurate and also a nearly complete misrepresentation of what was actually happening. The gala was the annual centrepiece of the charity calendar, and its planning was a months-long undertaking that would have been considered a major project in any professional setting. The venue had to be secured a year in advance at the good places, the entertainment negotiated, the programme designed, the tables sold to donors whose willingness to give was itself a relationship requiring ongoing cultivation, which meant lunches and phone calls and thank you notes and the careful maintenance of a sense that their contribution was valued and visible and had consequences in the world, because donors who felt unseen became former donors very quickly. You chaired the gala, or you co-chaired it, which meant navigating the particular complexity of a shared leadership structure with someone whose organisational style was different from yours, which required its own separate diplomacy. You did this while also managing the house and the children and the social calendar and the dinner parties and the committee meetings, and you did not describe any of this as demanding because demanding was not the approved register for how women of your position discussed their lives. The cheque was presented at the end of the gala by the board chair, usually male, often the husband of one of the women who had organised the entire enterprise, and his name appeared first in the programme. This was simply how it was done. You didn't comment on it. You applauded with everyone else, and your table applauded a little louder, and then you began planning next year's. There is a phrase, ladies who lunch, and it has become shorthand for a certain kind of decorative idleness, a gentle mockery of women who had nothing better to do than eat salads and talk about nothing. But the women who lunched in the grand restaurants and private clubs of 1950s America were doing something considerably more complicated than the phrase suggests. Lunch was where alliances were made and broken. It was where information was exchanged about whose husband's business was having difficulties, whose child was at risk of being excluded from the right social circle, and whose family might be quietly leaking money faster than appearances could cover. It was a form of collective intelligence gathering and maintenance that kept the social ecosystem running, and it was conducted over white tablecloths and perfectly arranged silver with a smoothness that concealed how much actual work was happening behind every carefully chosen word. The mechanics of information exchange at lunch operated on a frequency that required fluency to receive. Nothing was said directly. Everything was communicated. A slight widening of the eyes before someone's name was mentioned. A pause that lasted a beat too long after a question about someone's husband. The careful non-answer to a direct question. The redirection. The subject change executed so smoothly it almost did not register as a subject change. You learned to hear these signals the way musicians learn to hear the space between notes, because the space was where the meaning lived. Being excluded from the lunch was worse than being discussed at it. Discussion meant you were present enough in the social landscape to be talked about, which was unpleasant but recoverable. Exclusion meant you had drifted out of the landscape entirely, which was a form of social death that operated in slow motion and was very difficult to reverse. Women who moved cities and lost their table lost years of social capital that could not be rebuilt quickly, because social capital in this world was a function of accumulated presence and shared history and the particular trust that came from being known over time, and time could not be hurried. The restaurant itself was part of the communication. Where your lunch said something. The right club had a waiting list for membership that stretched years. The right table at the right restaurant was assigned or assigned itself over time through the consistency of your presence, and the maitre d' who recognized you and seated you without consulting. The reservation book was confirming something in front of witnesses that was worth being confirmed. The food, as previously mentioned, was beside the point. You ordered the chicken, or the sole, or the light salad that signalled you were watching yourself without the indignity of appearing to be watching yourself. You ate approximately half of it. You drank 1 glass of wine, or occasionally 2 if the conversation warranted, and the conversation sometimes warranted. You stayed for exactly as long as the occasion required and not longer, because lingering past the natural end of a lunch suggested you had nowhere else to be, which was the one thing you could never appear to be true, even when it was entirely true. Every Thursday or Wednesday, or whichever day had been reserved for the purpose, the wealthy woman of 1950s America went to the salon. Not because she was vain, although vanity was permitted in measured doses, but because appearance maintenance was a professional obligation in the same way that a lawyer maintained their credentials. The hair was set weekly because it had to be set weekly. The nails were done. The brows were shaped. These were not indulgences, they were the cost of doing business in a world where your appearance was your first and most continuously evaluated credential. The salon was also, not coincidentally, an excellent place to exchange information with other women in various states of chemical processing, all of them temporarily captive and therefore unusually willing to talk. More useful intelligence was gathered under the dry hood at a good salon than in most committee meetings, and the atmosphere was considerably more honest. Your relationship with your hairdresser was one of the more genuinely intimate relationships in your life, and this was not an accident. He and the good hairdressers at the good salons were often men, which was its own social arrangement, saw you in a state of partial construction. Your hair wet and uncombed, your face without the full armour of makeup, your posture relaxed in the salon chair, in a way it rarely was anywhere else. He knew your natural colour, which was information you did not share widely. He knew how your hair behaved in humidity, and what it did in the week before your period, and which side your part needed to be on to compensate for the slight asymmetry in your face that only the two of you, and perhaps your husband, had ever noticed. You talked to him in the easy register of someone who was not being evaluated, or you did not talk, and that was also fine, because a good hairdresser understood the difference between the client who needed to debrief and the client who needed 90 minutes of quiet and treated both with equal professional respect. Either way, you emerge from the salon looking like yourself but improved, which was precisely the effect required. Not a transformation, not a performance, just the continuous maintenance of an appearance that had to remain consistently, reliably, correctly you. The manicure happened at the same appointment or a separate one depending on the salon's setup and your preference. The nails in the 1950s were a specific red, not the deepest crimson, which read as dramatic, and not the palest blush, which read as unfinished, a mid-range red with a name like cherries in the snow or Persian melon that you'd been wearing for years because it was correct, and you had found correct, and were not interested in departing from it. Chipped nails were not acceptable in public, and were barely acceptable in private. You maintained them the way you maintained everything else, which was continuously, and without acknowledgement that maintenance was being performed. By the time you left the salon on Thursday afternoon, hair freshly set, nails lacquered and drying with exquisite care, as you navigated the car door without smudging them, you were ready again. Ready for the weekend's social obligations, ready for the dinner party Saturday night, ready to be seen, which in this world was the constant and never-ending requirement, and which you met week after week with the quiet and determined professionalism of someone who had never been given another option. Raising children in 1950s upper-class America was less about the daily work of parenting, which was handled, and more about the strategic management of their trajectory, which was handled by the mother and no one else regardless of what anyone said about it. Which nursery school had the right waiting list? Which primary school fed into the correct secondary school? Which summer camps would produce the kind of friendships that would last into adulthood and prove socially useful? Which dancing classes? Which piano teachers? Which sports? Because sports mattered now, especially for boys, and the right sports mattered more than sports in general. The mothers of wealthy 1950s households managed these decisions with the intensity of portfolio managers, tracking outcomes and adjusting strategy, and comparing notes with other mothers doing the same thing at the same lunch tables, conducting an entirely parallel and equally serious professional operation that no one called a career. The nursery school application was the beginning, and it was taken seriously in a way that startled people who had not been through it. There were schools in certain cities whose waiting lists required your name to be placed before the child was born, in some cases before the pregnancy was confirmed, because the competition for spots was real, and the consequences of the wrong school were understood to operate decades into the future. Like a stone dropped into water, whose ripples you could still see at your child's 40th birthday. You attended the school tour. You met the director. You wrote the letter that was not required but whose absence was noted. You brought the child to the assessment playdate in their best outfit and hoped they would perform approximately like themselves rather than like a small person who had been overcoached, because overcoaching was detectable and held against the family. The paediatrician was chosen with similar deliberateness. Not just any paediatrician, the one whose practice included the families whose children would be at the same schools, whose office had the right address, whose manner with children was warm and whose manner with mothers was appropriately respectful without being overly familiar. You brought the children in for every scheduled appointment and you arrived on time, and you had your questions prepared in writing because prepared questions signalled that you were paying attention, and paying attention to your children's health was a form of competence that also went into the general ledger. The school conferences happened twice a year, and you attended both, because not attending suggested you were not interested in your child's progress, which was not a signal you were going to send. You sat across from the teacher, who was almost always a woman, and you listened to the assessment of your child's reading and arithmetic and social development, and you took notes, and you came away with an action plan that you then implemented at home through targeted practice, disguised as games because direct academic pressure on young children was considered poor form in certain circles. All of this was invisible labour conducted on behalf of people who were too small to understand it was happening. Your children would not know until decades later, if they ever knew at all, how much strategic thinking had been devoted to the architecture of their early lives. They would simply arrive at the right school, with the right friends, in the right sports programme, and find it all already waiting for them, as if by effortless arrangement. Which was, of course, exactly what you had intended. In 1955, a new category of pharmaceutical product arrived in American medicine that would define the decade for a very specific demographic: the mild tranquilizer. Miltown came first, Valium followed. Doctors prescribed them in remarkable quantities to women who presented with symptoms that included anxiety, restlessness, difficulty sleeping, vague dissatisfaction, and a persistent sense that something was wrong without being able to identify what. The women were not lying about their symptoms, and the doctors were not wrong to treat them. But what was being treated, what the pills were managing, was a way of life that had been constructed to minimize disruption for everyone except the person living it. The pills smoothed the friction. They lowered the volume on whatever the interior noise was. They made it possible to get through the dinner party, the luncheon, the committee meeting, the quiet afternoon with a placid expression that matched the life that appeared, from a certain angle, to be perfectly fine. Miltown was prescribed so widely and so casually that it became a cultural shorthand within a few years of its introduction. By the late 1950s, it was the most prescribed drug in American history up to that point. Physicians handed it to women the way they handed out advice about posture, matter-of-factly, without extended inquiry into what was producing the symptoms it was designed to relieve. You presented. You described the difficulty sleeping, the vague anxiety, the sense of being wound too tight for reasons you could not precisely articulate. The doctor nodded. The prescription was written. You filled it at the pharmacy where the pharmacist knew your name and put it in a small amber bottle, and you brought it home and put it in the medicine cabinet next to the face cream and the aspirin, where it sat as a kind of option, available on the evenings when the quiet became too loud. Not every woman took them. Some did, some didn't, and the line between the two was not always the line between the women who were struggling and the women who were not. It was sometimes the line between the women who'd been to the right doctor and the women whose doctor was still operating in the previous decade's framework. It was sometimes the line between the women who trusted the medical establishment's interpretation of their experience and the women who had a nagging sense that the pharmaceutical solution was being applied to a structural problem, which was a sophisticated analysis for 1957, but not an unavailable one for intelligent women who'd been quietly observing their own circumstances for years. The nerve pill, as it was sometimes called in a tone that was simultaneously dismissive and sympathetic, was the 1950s answer to the question the 1950s was not asking, which was, what happens to very capable people when you remove all the outlets for their capability and ask them to perform contentment indefinitely? The answer, it turned out, was a prescription, a small one, taken discreetly, not discussed at lunch, though sometimes discussed after enough wine, in the particular confidence of women who'd been friends long enough to move past the performing. It was, in the end, a technological solution to a social problem. And it worked, in the narrow sense that the dinner parties continued and the committees met and the houses were maintained and the appearances were kept. Which was, in the narrow sense, the point. The hospital auxiliary was where a certain kind of woman found herself doing work that was genuinely useful for the first time in years, and the relief of it was almost embarrassing in its intensity. You organised the gift shop, you coordinated volunteers, you raised funds for equipment, you wrote the newsletter and managed the schedules and handled logistics that would have been called administrative management if anyone in the building had been getting paid for them. You were not. But there was something happening here, some combination of competence and consequence and forward motion that the rest of the schedule did not reliably provide. Women who chaired hospital auxiliaries in 1950s, America ran organizations of considerable complexity, and did so with no training, no title, and no acknowledgement beyond a thank you at the annual meeting, and many of them were quite good at it in ways that they did not entirely know how to think about. The hospital itself was a different kind of environment from the club and the committee room and the private home. There were sick people in it. There were genuine needs operating at a different register from the social needs that occupied most of your waking hours. When you organised the volunteers to bring books to patients who could not get out of bed, or when the gift shop funds you had raised paid for a piece of equipment that the hospital could not otherwise have afforded, the outcome was legible in a way that the outcome of a successful dinner party was not quite legible. Something had happened. Something real. You could see it. This was not a small thing for women whose daily accomplishments were largely invisible by design. The smoothly running household produced no artifact. The successful luncheon left no lasting evidence. The committee meeting generated minutes that no one reread. But the hospital wing that the auxiliary's capital campaign had helped fund had a plaque, and the plaque had the auxiliary's name on it, and the name was collective rather than individual, but it was there, in the building, in a material and durable form, and you had been part of making it exist. The relationships formed in the auxiliary were also different in texture from the social friendships of the club. Working alongside someone in the gift shop on a Tuesday afternoon, sorting donations and managing inventory, and dealing with the particular logistical puzzle of a small retail operation run entirely by volunteers, produced a kind of ease and directness that the luncheon table did not always permit. You talked differently when you were doing something with your hands. The performing register dropped a little. The conversation moved into the practical and sometimes into the personal, and occasionally into territory that surprised you both. You came home from the hospital on Tuesday afternoons with a tiredness that was different in quality from the tiredness of the committee meeting, or the luncheon, or the dinner party management. It was the tiredness of having been genuinely useful, which had a specific and not unpleasant weight to it, and you carried it home through the front door and set it down in the entrance hall and went to refresh yourself for cocktail hour. And somewhere inside the routine of the evening you held on to it quietly, as evidence of something, though evidence of what exactly was harder to say. Every summer the wealthy family decamped from the city to somewhere cooler. The Hamptons, the Cape, a lake house in the mountains, a cottage on a main island, and this was considered a respite, a break, a reward for the year's social labours. What it actually was, from the wife's perspective, was the same domestic operation transplanted to a location with worse plumbing and no reliable cook. The staff configuration changed. Some help came along, some did not. The children were suddenly everywhere and needed managing. The husband came on weekends and expected the same quality of environment he had in the city, which now needed to be maintained without the same infrastructure. The social calendar continued. Neighbouring houses had to be visited and visitors had to be received, and the right people had to be seen at the right places along the waterfront, just in a slightly more casual register, which in practice meant the same effort with a linen blouse instead of a cocktail dress. The move itself was a logistical operation that began weeks before departure. What went to the house and what stayed in the city. The kitchen needed to be stocked from scratch because the lake house pantry did not maintain itself through the winter and arrived each June empty and requiring replenishment. The children's summer wardrobes had to be reviewed and augmented because children grew in directions that were inconvenient, and the summer clothes from last year now fit differently or not at all. The summer reading, the summer sports equipment, the summer social obligations, invitations extended, invitations received, the calendar that had to be established before you arrived so you were not simply reacting to whatever the summer produced on its own terms. The lake or the beach or the mountain air was genuinely restorative. And this is important to say clearly because the experience was not without pleasure. There was something in the loosening of the city's structure that even the most organised woman felt as relief. The children could run. The schedule relaxed its grip by some measurable degree. The evenings were earlier and quieter, and the darkness came with stars that the city did not have. You sat on the porch after dinner with a drink in a way that was easier than the city's version of the same gesture, and the sound was water or wind rather than traffic, and for a few hours something in you that was usually braced against something released a little. But the weekends, when the husbands arrived by train or by car from the city, tightened things back up. The house had to be ready for his arrival in the way that it always had to be ready for his arrival, which meant the children had to be managed into a presentable state, and the meals had to be organised, and the social obligations of the weekend, the neighbours for dinner on Saturday, the club for lunch on Sunday, had to be executed with the same precision that the city required, just with a screen door that didn't close properly, and a cook who had stayed in the city and was being replaced by your own efforts, plus whatever local help you had managed to arrange, which was never quite the equivalent. By Labour Day you were ready to go back, not because the summer had been unpleasant, but because the city's infrastructure made everything easier, and easier was not a small thing when everything was your responsibility. You packed the house back up, closed the shutters, arranged for the caretaker, drove back to the city with the children and the luggage and the summer's accumulated evidence of a life lived outdoors, and the apartment was waiting, cool and still and exactly as you had left it. And for 24 hours before the schedule resumed, you moved through it with a particular kind of gratitude for floors that did not creak, and plumbing that worked reliably, and a cook who would be back on Monday morning. If you wanted to understand what was expected of a wealthy American woman in 1953, you did not have to go far. The magazines would tell you everything. Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, House Beautiful, the Ladies' Home Journal, Town and Country. These publications delivered month after month a detailed and remarkably consistent vision of feminine excellence. The correct body, the correct wardrobe, the correct home, the correct attitude toward your husband, your children, your social obligations, and yourself. The advice columns addressed reader questions about every conceivable domestic and relational problem with a serenity that suggested the answers were obvious, which perhaps they were if you existed inside the same set of assumptions as the magazine. What they did not address, and what was conspicuous in its absence, was the question of whether the entire arrangement made sense, because that question was not available in 1953. It would arrive later. In the meantime, there were instructions, and the instructions were extremely detailed. The fashion magazines told you what to wear to the degree of specificity that left very little room for personal interpretation. Not just the silhouette, the nipped waist, the full skirt, the structured shoulder that defined the decade, but the accessories for the silhouette, and the occasions for the accessories, and the way to move in the resulting ensemble so that the whole effect read as effortless. Models in these magazines stood with a particular quality of arranged stillness that communicated wealth and composure simultaneously, and the aspiration was not to look like the model, but to produce the feeling the model communicated, which was a woman who had everything correctly arranged and was not troubled by the arrangement. The home magazines were equally instructive and considerably more granular. The proper way to set a table for a dinner of 8, the correct approach to a guest bedroom from the quality of the linen, to the placement of the reading lamp, to the small consideration of a glass of water and a flower on the nightstand that signalled your guests were expected, and their comfort had been anticipated. The appropriate gift for a hostess and its proper presentation. The management of domestic staff, including how to hire, how to correct errors, and how to let someone go in a way that was firm without being unkind, because unkindness was a form of social failure even in private. All of this was available monthly, in beautiful photographs, in a prose style of breezy authority that made the instructions feel less like rules and more like the natural behaviour of women who had things properly understood. The advice columns were where the human cost occasionally surfaced, in the compressed and redirected form of letters from women describing situations that contained, if you read carefully, a great deal of invisible pain. The letter about the husband who came home distant, and the columnist's advice about creating a warmer domestic atmosphere. The letter about the woman who felt restless and purposeless, and the columnist's advice about finding meaning in service to family and community. The letters that described, in the careful language of women writing for publication in 1954, something that did not have a name yet, and the answers that addressed everything except the unnamed thing. You read the magazines. Everyone read the magazines. They were delivered to the house, and they were read, and they were discussed at the luncheon table, and some of their advice was followed, and some of it was adapted, and some of it was quietly set aside by women who knew better from experience, but would not have said so out loud because saying so would have required a framework that would not arrive in print for another decade. In the meantime, the magazines arrived and the instructions continued, and the photographs were very beautiful, and the women in them looked perfectly, serenely, completely fine. By the mid-1950s, psychoanalysis had become sufficiently fashionable in certain wealthy American circles that a woman could admit she was seeing an analyst without it being a social catastrophe. This was genuinely new. Freudian ideas had filtered into the culture through the universities and the magazines and the general post-war appetite for self-understanding, and the result was that a subset of bored, intelligent, underutilized women in very nice houses found themselves sitting in book-lined offices twice a week, talking about their childhoods, while a man with a notepad nodded. What they said in those rooms was private, but the fact that they were there at all was a signal, not that these women were unstable, but that something was producing enough interior pressure to require a professional outlet. Most of their analysts, working within a Freudian framework, would interpret that pressure as a problem with the woman. A decade later, a woman named Betty Friedan would suggest a different interpretation. The office itself was a particular kind of room: dark wood, books, a couch, or a deep chair, depending on whether your analyst was a strict Freudian or a more conversational type. A box of tissues on a small table within arm's reach, positioned there the way the cocktail napkins were positioned on the drinks tray, with the studied casualness of something that had been thought about. You arrived at the correct time and you left at the correct time, and the 50 minutes in between belonged to you in a way that almost nothing else in your week belonged to you, which was itself disorienting, because a room in which the entire purpose was for you to speak about your own interior experience was not a room you had much prior practice in. What did you talk about? Your mother eventually, because it always came to your mother eventually. Your marriage, in the careful language of a woman who understood that what was said in this room was confidential, but who had also been trained since childhood to manage her disclosures in any room. Your dreams, which the analyst found significant and which you found mostly confusing and occasionally alarming. Your childhood, which had been comfortable and structured, and which had produced in you a set of capabilities that your current life deployed partially, and a set of questions that your current life did not address at all. The analyst listened. He reflected. He asked questions that seemed simple and arrived somewhere complicated. He did not tell you what to do, which was both the point and occasionally maddening, because what you wanted, underneath the therapy-appropriate desire for self-understanding, was someone to tell you what to do. Or more precisely, someone to confirm that what you were already sensing about your life was real, and not a symptom of a character deficiency that could be corrected with the right attitude adjustment. What the Freudian framework offered instead was the suggestion that your restlessness was rooted in your psychological development, in unresolved dynamics from your earliest relationships, in the particular architecture of your unconscious, which could be explored and perhaps reorganized through sufficient analysis. This was interesting. It was also from the perspective of a woman sitting in a beautiful house with a full staff and a social calendar, and a persistent sense that something essential was missing, not entirely satisfying as an explanation. You went twice a week. You paid the fee, which was substantial. You kept the appointment the way you kept all appointments, reliably and on time. And you walked out of the office into the afternoon and got into the car and went to the next thing on the schedule, carrying whatever the session had produced. Insight, confusion, a half-formed thought that needed more time, into a day that had no particular space for any of it, but which continued, as days do, regardless. Sunday in the life of a wealthy 1950s family was structured around church attendance the way Saturday was structured around social engagements. It was not optional. It was not primarily about personal faith, and the effort it required was considerably more than it appeared. The clothes had to be right. The children had to be presentable. The family had to arrive, together and on time, and sit in or near the same pew they always occupied, because families had pews the way they had tables at restaurants, and both were forms of territorial claim. After church came the coffee hour, which was socially identical to the luncheon except that it occurred before noon, and God had recently been mentioned. The minister knew your name. You knew his. You served on a committee for the church as well as for the symphony and the hospital, because the church also had committees, and the committees also needed women who were good at things. Getting 4 people out of the house on Sunday morning in the correct clothes at the correct time was an achievement whose difficulty was in inverse proportion to how easy it appeared to anyone watching you arrive at the church door. The children's Sunday clothes were pressed on Saturday. Shoes were polished Saturday evening. Your own outfit was selected in advance because Sunday morning did not have the flexibility for a wardrobe deliberation. It had a departure time, and the departure time was non-negotiable, and everything upstream of the departure time had to be accomplished in a compressed window during which the children were eating breakfast, and your husband was reading the paper, and the cook was not working, because even the cook had Sunday morning off, which meant you were managing breakfast yourself, in your good dress, with an awareness of the time that was active and continuous and not visible on your face. The church was Episcopal, almost certainly, or Presbyterian, or Congregationalist, the denominations of the northeastern establishment, the ones whose architecture was appropriately restrained, and whose congregations included the families whose children went to the right schools and whose names appeared in the right places. The service had a rhythm you had known since childhood. The hymns were familiar. The liturgy was steady. There was something genuinely comforting in the continuity of it, in the fact that this particular sequence of words and gestures had been performed in this particular building for generations and would continue to be performed after you, which was a thought that could be peaceful or slightly vertiginous depending on the Sunday. The sermon was delivered by a minister who was intelligent and moderate, and occasionally said something that lodged in your thinking for days afterward, though you would not have described yourself as a particularly spiritual person. You were a faithful person in the sense that you attended and participated and contributed and believed in something, broadly, though the something was not always easy to specify in the direct way that direct questions required. After the service came the coffee, and the coffee was the point of Sunday morning for a significant portion of the congregation, which everyone understood and no one said. You stood in the bright parish hall with a cup in your hand and moved through a series of conversations that were lighter in register than the luncheon, and warmer in register than the committee meeting, and which constituted collectively the social maintenance of a community that used the church as its organising infrastructure the way earlier versions of the same community had used it for centuries. You drove home. Sunday lunch was cold cuts or something simple that didn't require the cook. The afternoon was the quietest of the week, and it was the one afternoon that carried cultural permission to be quiet, and you used it, and the using of it felt some Sundays almost like rest. For a wealthy woman in 1950s America, aging was something that happened to other people, or rather something that was supposed to be managed with sufficient vigilance that it did not visibly happen to you. The face creams appeared in the 1930s and had been in use ever since. The posture had been maintained through decades of self-consciousness. The weight was monitored, quietly and constantly, because extra weight was a form of social failure in these circles. A visible suggestion that you had stopped trying was managed through portion control and occasional dangerous diets that no one discussed openly. The hair was coloured if necessary, which it was, and the colouring was done in such a way that it looked natural, because admitting you coloured your hair was a form of admission that time was winning. You were not going to admit that. You were going to continue appearing at luncheons in the correct shoes until someone pried them off you. The face cream regimen had been established early and was not departed from. Cleansing cream at night. Toner. A night cream of some density that smelled vaguely of roses and cold, and the particular optimism of believing that what you applied to your face at 11 o'clock would produce a measurable difference by morning. A day cream lighter than the night cream, with a hint of coverage. The eye cream applied with the ring finger in a specific dabbing motion that you had read about in a magazine in 1941 and had been performing ever since. The neck, because the neck was where women gave themselves away, and you'd been told this early and had taken it seriously and applied everything to the neck as well as the face for 20 years in a preventative campaign whose results were genuinely impressive. The weight was the more fraught business. The ideal silhouette of the 1950s required a waist, and a waist required either a natural tendency in that direction or a sustained and disciplined relationship with your own appetite that was never discussed as discipline, because discipline suggested effort, and effort suggested the result was not natural, and the result was supposed to appear natural. You ate carefully at every meal. You did not finish things. You declined the bread, or you took a small piece and did not take another. At dinner parties you ate enough to be polite and not enough to be notable, and you navigated the dessert course with the smooth expertise of someone who'd been navigating it for 30 years. Exercise was not discussed as exercise in the way it would be discussed in later decades, with its own language and culture and equipment. You moved, you walked, you played tennis at the club during the season, which was genuinely pleasurable and also conveniently maintained the arms and the general architecture of the body. You climbed the stairs in the house rather than taking any imaginary elevator. You stood correctly, which was its own sustained physical effort, the spine straight, the shoulders back, the head level, because posture was a visible commitment to not giving in. The alternative, giving in, was not available. A woman who visibly stopped managing her appearance was communicating something about her relationship to her own life, and the communication was received clearly by everyone around her, and the reception of it had social consequences that were real even if they were never stated. So you continued. The creams, the salon, the tennis, the careful plate. You aged because aging was not actually preventable, but you aged in the approved direction, gradually, gracefully, with your standards intact, and you did it as if it cost you nothing, which was the final and perhaps the most demanding performance of all. Every wealthy mother of the 1950s wanted her daughter to have a good life, and a good life was defined in specific and largely unquestioned terms. The right education, meaning a women's college or a suitable co-educational university, where she would meet the right sort of people. The right engagement, meaning a man of appropriate background and prospects announced within a reasonable time after graduation. The right wedding, meaning a ceremony of scale and elegance that demonstrated the family's standing without tipping into vulgarity. And the right subsequent life, meaning one that closely resembled her mother's, which was considered a compliment. If the daughter had ideas of a different kind, professional ambitions, unconventional companions, a desire to travel and figure things out before settling, these were treated as a phase, a temporary navigational error from which she would eventually correct course. Most did, some did not, and those daughters would spend decades being gently worried about at luncheons. The preparation began early. A daughter in a wealthy 1950s household was educated in the skills of her future life the way a tradesman's child learned the trade, by proximity, observation, and gradual incorporation into the work. She watched her mother manage the household. She watched her mother receive guests, manage the staff, organize the dinner party, write the thank you notes. She attended from an appropriate age the kinds of social events that would constitute her adult life, wearing the correct clothes and practicing the correct manner and learning, through repetition and occasional correction, how a woman of her position was supposed to move through the world. Dancing classes, piano lessons through at least a competent level, because an educated woman could play the piano at a gathering without making anyone uncomfortable. French, if possible, because French was the language of culture, and also of the European travel that awaited a certain kind of well-positioned young woman in her college years. Deportment, the word was slightly old-fashioned even by the 1950s, but the concept was very much alive, which meant posture and poise, and the particular quality of composed attention that communicated breeding without announcing it. The college years were understood to be the period during which the daughter would complete her education, in both the academic and the social sense, and the social sense was not considered secondary. The right dormitory, the right sorority if the college had them, the right friendships with young women whose families were known quantities and whose brothers were therefore potential introductions. The right young man, identified ideally before junior year so that the senior year could be conducted with the comfortable security of a settled future, rather than the unpleasant uncertainty of an unsettled one. You wanted for your daughter what you had, minus whatever had been difficult about it, which was a complicated and not always conscious editing process. You wanted her to be secure. You wanted her to be loved by someone reliable. You wanted her to be part of a world you recognized and could visit easily. What you did not quite allow yourself to want, because the wanting would have required more self-examination than the 1950s generally encouraged, was for her to have the parts of your life that you had quietly set aside. The afternoon quiet, the reading you did with the door closed, the things you were good at that had no name and therefore no acknowledgement, Your daughter was going to have a good life. You were certain of it. You had arranged a great deal of it already, carefully and invisibly, the way you arranged everything. While the daughters were being prepared for the right kind of life, the sons were being prepared for success, and success had a specific shape that left very little room for deviation. The right prep school, the right university, the right club at that university. A period of useful military service if required, which it was during this era, followed by entry into a career, law, finance, business, occasionally medicine, in which the family's connections would provide a useful initial advantage and from which the son would be expected to build something substantial. These boys were loved fiercely and shaped relentlessly, and the shaping was done largely by their mothers in the domestic years and by their schools and fathers in the professional ones. And the tension between what a boy was and what he was expected to become was nobody's acknowledged business, because the expectation was so total and so old that questioning it required a kind of courage that the 1950s did not reliably supply. The prep school decision was made when the boy was approximately old enough to understand that a decision was being made about him, but young enough that he had no vocabulary for objecting to it. The schools were in New England, most of them, stone buildings and athletic fields, and a tradition of producing young men of a specific type, serious and capable and appropriately self-contained, who went on to the universities that produced men of the same type, in a self-reinforcing cycle that had been running for generations and showed no signs of exhaustion. You visited the school with your husband, you met the headmaster, you sent the boy away in September with his trunk packed and his name taped on everything, and a composed expression that you maintained until the car was moving and then set aside. At home without him, the house had a different quality, quieter in a specific way, a boy-shaped quiet. And you wrote letters that were cheerful and informative and carefully not anxious, because anxious letters communicated anxiety to the boy, and anxiety in a boy at a school like that had consequences. He wrote back occasionally, in the brief and concrete style of a child who was fine and did not know how to say so. You read these letters more times than you read anything else that arrived at the house, and filed them in a box in the desk drawer and did not mention the box to anyone. The pressure on your son was not acknowledged as pressure because it was indistinguishable from love, which in the context of this world it partly was. You wanted him to succeed. His father wanted him to succeed. The school wanted him to succeed. The university he would attend wanted him to succeed. The career he would enter wanted him to succeed. At no point in this sequence was he asked whether success in these particular terms was what he wanted, because the question was not available. It was assumed, the way so much was assumed, that the shape of the life being prepared for him was the shape of a good life, and that a good life was what everyone wanted, and that wanting something else was a confusion that would resolve itself when he was older. Some of them resolved, some of them did not, and those sons appeared at dinner parties in their 30s with a quality of muted distance that their wives managed carefully, and their parents attributed to the pressures of work, which was partly correct and not entirely the whole story. You loved your son without reservation. The reservation was in the architecture of the world you had handed him, which was the same architecture that had been handed to you, which you had not designed and could not quite dismantle and would not have known how to begin. In any wealthy 1950s household, the people who understood the family best were the ones who worked in it. The housekeeper knew the exact quality of the marriage from the tone of the Tuesday morning conversation. The cook knew which family member was under stress from what was left on whose plate. The nanny knew which child was struggling and which parent was unavailable, and how the household's emotional weather ran from week to week. These women, and they were almost always women, and often black women in an era when domestic service was one of the few reliably available forms of employment, held a tremendous amount of knowledge about the lives of the people they worked for, and they held it in silence, because discretion was both a professional requirement and a survival skill in a world that held enormous power over them in return for the wage. The wealthy women who employed them often described these relationships with genuine warmth, and the warmth was sometimes real. The power differential was also real, and neither cancelled the other out. The housekeeper arrived at 8 and moved through the house with a systematic thoroughness that was its own form of intelligence. She knew where everything was and where everything was supposed to be, and the distance between those two states was her daily project. She noticed what was out of place, the glass left on the wrong surface, the book left open at a page that suggested something about what had been on the reader's mind, the slight disorder in the guest bedroom that indicated a conversation had continued in there after the lights in the rest of the house had gone down. She noted these things, and she addressed the physical ones, and she filed the others in a part of her understanding of the household that she never referenced directly. The cook knew the family through food, which is a form of knowing that is more intimate than it sounds. She knew which child would eat something willingly, and which required strategic preparation, the vegetable hidden in the sauce, the unfamiliar thing presented alongside a familiar one to reduce the strangeness. She knew the husband's preferences with a precision that matched his wife's, and she executed them reliably, and on the occasions when something went slightly wrong, she knew from the way the plate returned whether it had been noticed, and how much it had mattered. She knew when the household was hosting important guests from the quality of attention she was asked to bring to the menu, and she brought it, because her own professional reputation was embedded in the family's social performance, whether she was acknowledged in it or not. The relationship between a wealthy woman and her domestic staff in the 1950s occupied a strange social territory that had no clean name. It was not friendship, though it sometimes had the warmth of friendship. It was not purely transactional, though it was absolutely a transaction. It was a sustained intimacy conducted across a power difference that was so total and so structural that it was mostly invisible to the person on the advantage side of it, because the most complete forms of privilege are the ones that feel like simply the way things are. The staff, for their part, navigated this territory with a professional sophistication that was itself a form of labour, unacknowledged and uncompensated on top of the actual labour. The management of a white employer's comfort, which included the management of her feelings about the relationship itself, whether she was being kind enough, whether she was being respected, was real work. It required skill and judgment, and a continuous calibration that left no room for the error that the employer's position allowed her to make freely. This was the 1950s, and these arrangements were old, and the distance between the warmth that was genuine and the justice that was absent was a distance that would take considerably longer than a decade to begin to close. Not every wealthy woman in 1955 wanted a different life. This is important to say clearly, because the story can tip easily into a simple narrative of universal trapped brilliance, yearning for freedom, and that is not quite accurate. Many women genuinely valued what they had, the stability, the beauty, the relationships, the social contribution, the deep pleasure of a well-run home and a successful child, and a community that knew your name. But alongside those women, and sometimes inside the same woman on different days, was something else, a restlessness, a recurring awareness of a self that existed somewhere behind the schedule and the wardrobe and the social performance, a self with specific interests, specific opinions, specific ambitions that did not fit neatly into any available category. That self did not have a name yet in 1955. It would get one a few years later, in a book published in 1963 by a woman who had interviewed suburban housewives and found, to no one's surprise except apparently everyone's, that many of them were not entirely fine. The restlessness arrived in specific moments rather than as a continuous condition, which made it harder to address and easier to set aside. It arrived in the afternoon quiet, when the house was still, and something in you that the morning's activity had successfully suppressed came back to the surface. It arrived at dinner parties when someone said something interesting about a subject you had read about in the books you read with the door closed, and you knew something substantive about it, and the conversational structure of the table did not quite have a place for what you knew, and you said something lighter instead, and the moment passed. It arrived at the committee meeting when you solved a logistical problem that had stumped everyone else in the room and felt for a moment the particular satisfaction of a mind working at its actual capacity, and then the meeting ended and you went home. You had been educated. Not to the level that your brothers had been educated, that was not how it worked, but you had gone to a good school and then to college, and you had studied things that interested you with a seriousness that your subsequent life had not quite found a use for. You had read history and you had opinions about it. You had studied literature and the opinions had only deepened. You had taken an economics course once and found it clarifying in a way that surprised you, and that you mentioned to your husband once at dinner, and he had smiled and said something kind and changed the subject, not dismissively, just changed it, because it had not quite fit the register of what dinner was for. The women who felt this most acutely were often the most capable, the ones whose organisational talent and intelligence would, in a different era, have produced careers of genuine distinction. Their capability found expression, but in the compressed and redirected form that the culture permitted. The household, the committees, the charity work, the management of children's futures. These were not nothing. They were real. But they were also not quite enough for the scale of what some of these women contained, and the distance between what they contained and what they were permitted to express with it produced something that had the shape of dissatisfaction, but felt from the inside more like a question that was not being answered. The question would eventually get louder. By the early 1960s, it was audible in the culture in a new way, in the conversations at luncheon tables and in the letters to magazine editors, and in the book that sat on the nightstand of women who had been told their whole lives that the life they had was the life they should want, and who were reading very carefully to see if someone else had noticed what they had noticed, which was that the life and the wanting had never quite lined up, and that this might not be their fault. Membership in the right clubs was not a social convenience. It was structural, foundational, the invisible architecture that held the entire world together. The country club, the city club, the women's club, the garden club, the yacht club if the geography permitted. Entry into these institutions was controlled by existing members through a process of invitation and vetting that was simultaneously casual in its manner and brutal in its precision. The wrong family background could disqualify you. The wrong profession, the wrong religion, and in certain clubs in certain cities, the wrong religion meant Jewish, and this was the 1950s, and it was said plainly in the membership criteria and defended without particular embarrassment by people who considered themselves cultured. The women who navigated these systems were operating inside something they had not designed and often did not question, because it had always been there, and what had always been there had a way of seeming natural even when it was simply old. The application process for a significant club was not formal in the way a job application was formal. There was no form, no interview in the traditional sense, no stated criteria against which you were evaluated. What there was instead was a proposer, meaning a current member who put your name forward and staked their own social credibility on your suitability, and a seconder, meaning a second current member who endorsed the proposal, and then a period during which the membership committee, a group of people whose specific composition was itself socially significant, considered the application without explaining their deliberations to anyone. The decision arrived by letter. Acceptance meant you were in. Rejection meant you were not, and no explanation was offered, and asking for one would have confirmed whatever concern had produced the rejection. The country club in summer was where the children swam in the pool supervised by the lifeguard, while you played tennis with women whose membership had preceded yours by decades, or whose membership was more recent and whose position in the club social hierarchy was therefore still being established, including sometimes your own. The lunch at the club was different from the restaurant lunch, more relaxed in setting, less formal in the specific obligations of the table, but no less freighted with social information. Who sat with whom? Who arrived together? Who waved from across the terrace and who came over? Exclusion from the clubs operated in the specific and painful way of exclusion from anything that structures your world. You were not prevented from living, but you were prevented from living in the particular way that your peers lived, and the gap between your world and theirs was visible in small daily ways that accumulated over time into something that was genuinely difficult. Families who had recently moved to a city, or who were new to the relevant tier of wealth, or who had some aspect of their background that the membership committee found disqualifying, experienced this gap and navigated it with varying degrees of grace and varying degrees of internal cost. You were in the clubs. You had been proposed by the right person at the right time, and the letter had arrived and you had joined. From inside the membership, the exclusions were invisible, in the specific way that comfort always renders its preconditions invisible. You did not see the mechanism because the mechanism was working in your favour, and mechanisms working in your favour have a quality of seeming like simply the natural order of things, rather than the operation of a system that someone had designed and that could, in principle, have been designed differently. This thought was available in the 1950s if you were inclined toward it. Most people were not particularly inclined. Somewhere around 11 o'clock, when the house was quiet and the children were long in bed and the dinner guests had driven home and the husband was reading or already asleep, there was a moment that belonged entirely to the woman of the house. She sat at her vanity and removed the earrings and the bracelets and the careful face she had been wearing since 7 in the morning. The cream went on. The hair came down. The robe went on in place of the evening clothes. And for a few minutes, in the privacy of her own bathroom in her beautifully decorated house, in the right neighbourhood with the right family and the right life, she existed outside of all of it, in a quiet that was either restful or revealing depending on the night. Some nights it was peaceful. Some nights the quiet had a texture that was harder to sit with, a kind of accumulated weight that did not have a name and was not spoken about, and would be set aside again in the morning when the alarm went off and the performance resumed and there was simply, mercifully, too much to do to think about it. The earrings first, they were good ones, pearl or small diamonds or something similarly appropriate, and they went into the jewellery box with the practised motion of someone who had done this 10,000 times, which you had. The necklace unclasped, the bracelet laid beside it. The rings last, and the rings were a specific kind of removal, the engagement ring and the wedding band laid together in the small dish on the vanity that existed for exactly this purpose, and the moment of setting them down had a quality that was hard to describe, a laying down of the most visible markers of your identity, along with the day that had been organised around them. The face came off in stages, the lipstick on a tissue first, then the cold cream worked in small circles across the forehead and the cheeks and the neck, because the neck, always the neck, and then removed with a damp cloth, and the face that emerged from this process was the face without its credentials, the one that existed before the performance began and after it ended, the one that your husband had stopped really looking at years ago, in the way you stop looking at something that has always been there. You looked at it, briefly, not with vanity but with a kind of inventory, the same practical attention you brought to everything else in the house that required maintenance. Is this holding up? What does it need? What is the honest assessment? The honest assessment was that you were 41 years old and looked it and had managed 41 years old into something that was still, by the relevant standards, acceptable. and acceptable was the register you inhabited and were going to inhabit and had made a private peace with mostly. The hair down was the last thing, and the loosening of it had a physical quality of release that was slightly out of proportion with the act itself. The pins out, the brush through. The hair that had been arranged since 7 in the morning fell to its own shape, which was softer and less deliberate, and more actually yours than anything you had presented to the world all day. You turned off the bathroom light. The house was quiet around you, in the specific quiet of a house where everyone else is sleeping, and you alone are still briefly, privately awake. And you lay down, and the day released its grip, and somewhere in the loosening you were simply a person in a bed, without the schedule and the wardrobe and the careful, calibrated performance of a life that was, by all visible measures, exactly what it was supposed to be. Tomorrow it would begin again. But for now, this. Just this. The 1950s did not end cleanly. They blurred into the 60s the way all decades do, gradually and then suddenly, with certain things that had been building for years arriving all at once in a form that surprised everyone except the people it had been building inside. The wealthy women who had organised hospital auxiliaries with the focused intensity of executives began to hear about women who were doing those things for salaries. The daughters who had been expected to find husbands at college were encountering ideas about other possibilities. Betty Friedan's book landed in 1963 and was passed between women at luncheons and read in the quiet afternoon hours with the door closed, and the recognition it produced was not always comfortable, but it was unmistakable. The life that had been described as a privilege and a comfort was also, for many of the women who lived it, something considerably more complicated than that. And now, for the first time, there were words for it. The change did not arrive uniformly or all at once. It arrived differently for different women depending on their age, their temperament, their particular relationship to the life they had been living. For some, it arrived through their daughters, who came home from college in 1964 talking about things they had read, asking questions about their mother's choices in a tone that was not quite accusatory and not quite admiring, but somewhere between the two, which was uncomfortable for everyone. For others, it arrived through the newspapers, which were reporting on things that had not been reported before, organised protest, public demands, women speaking in the first-person plural about their collective situation, which was a new grammar and produced a new legibility. The luncheon table registered the change before most other things did, because the luncheon table was where the culture's temperature was taken in this world, and by 1962 the temperature had shifted. There were women at the table who were thinking about going back to school. There were women whose daughters had taken jobs and kept them after marriage, which would have been mildly scandalous 5 years earlier, and was now something closer to interesting. There were women who mentioned, with a careful casualness that concealed the significance of what they were mentioning, that they had been reading something or thinking about something or wondering about something, and the other women at the table received these mentions with a recognition that was its own form of communication. The husbands, by and large, did not notice the shift until it was already significant, which was somewhat their fault, and somewhat the fault of a situation in which the interior lives of their wives had never been particularly visible to them, not because their wives had hidden them deliberately, but because the entire structure of the life they shared had been designed to keep those interior lives in the domestic register, which was a register he did not enter with much frequency or attention. What happened next is a longer story than this one. It involves the 1960s and the 1970s, and a great deal of argument and reorganization and genuine transformation, and also a great deal of loss and confusion. Because transformations of this scale are not clean, and do not leave everyone better off immediately. But the beginning of it was right here, in the quiet afternoon hours of the 1950s, in the books read behind closed doors and the questions half-formed at the vanity at 11 o'clock, and the restlessness that had no name until it did. The women who had run the committees and organised the galas and managed the households and raised the children and maintained the appearance of effortless contentment for decades had, without entirely knowing it, been practicing something. Not just performing a life, but building a set of capabilities, organisational, relational, strategic, communicative, that were about to find a considerably larger stage. They were ready. They had, in certain ways, always been ready. The world was simply now, slowly and not without resistance, beginning to notice. And so, here you are. At the end of a very long day that began at 7 in the morning with pin curls and cold cream and a house dress that had been pressed the night before, and ended somewhere around 11 with the earrings in the dish and the hair finally down, and the quiet of a house that had been performing all day finally allowed to simply be still. You managed the breakfast and the staff and the children's departure and the committee meeting and the luncheon where everything important happened in the spaces between sentences. You refreshed your lipstick before he came home. You arranged the cocktails. You got through the dinner with the right expression on your face and the right words at the right moments, and the seating chart that nobody noticed because it had worked. And things that work are always invisible. You did all of it. You did it well, and most of it, nearly all of it, went without acknowledgement, because that was the arrangement, and the arrangement was old, and old things have a way of feeling permanent even when they are not. But here is what is true underneath the performance and the schedule and the perfectly coordinated accessories. Those women were not fragile. They were not decorative. They were not simply waiting for the world to give them permission to be something. They were already something, capable, strategic, perceptive, quietly formidable in ways the culture around them did not have adequate language for, and therefore mostly did not try to name. They ran organizations without titles. They managed households of genuine complexity, without the acknowledgement that complexity deserves. They raised children who would go on to change the world, and they did it while maintaining an appearance of serenity so complete that the effort behind it was essentially invisible, which was itself an extraordinary achievement, even if it was an achievement in service of a system that was not always serving them back. They were also, some of them, many of them, on certain afternoons in certain quiet rooms, lonely in a specific way. The loneliness of a person whose interior life has more rooms than the life around them has been designed to enter. That loneliness was real. It deserves to be named clearly and without apology, this many decades later, by people sleeping in houses with central heating and medicine that works, and the unrestricted use of their own ambition. So tonight, as you settle into your clean bed in your life that would be nearly unrecognizable to a woman in 1953, your career if you have one, your choices about whether to have one, your ability to say out loud what you actually think at a dinner table without recalibrating it for the audience first, maybe spare a quiet thought for the women who came before you in their silk robes and their correct shoes, managing everything with one hand while the other hand held just barely. The thread of a self they were not quite permitted to follow. They kept that thread, quietly, for a very long time, and eventually it led somewhere. Sleep well. You have earned it. And honestly, so did they.